Welcome to another episode of Just More Fix. This is James. With me in this episode is Lacey. You can find us online at justmorefix.com or on Twitter at justmorefix. If you like us, you can support us at Patreon, and you can give us a rating and review at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find us at. In this episode, we're going to talk about solo survival. And now, it's time to get our gaming fix. Welcome to another episode of Just More Fix. Today, as you heard, we are going to sit down and kind of talk about I Am Legend and survival fiction, horror, whatever I guess you want to call it. So, Lacey, you want to kind of take this away and set it up then? It's kind of your idea.
Sure. So I am reading I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. And I think it's kind of funny on here because it says, there's like a quote from Stephen King. It says, "Books like I Am Legend were an inspiration to me," Stephen King, which he sort of also has that weird, like, multi-genre sort of horror, sort of not, what do I do with this?
That's true.
Which I feel like horror is often the catch-all for things like that. Like, well, it's not really survival fiction because you added horrible creatures, so
yeah,
we'll stick it over here.
It is kind of strange because, like, if you think of...
There's so much overlap between mystery and horror, too, that, like, so many, like, bookstores have just gotten away with the horror section altogether. Like, it's either mystery or it's fiction, and you have to go search for it. It's definitely not in the romance section.
I think part of that is because maybe horror, in a way, has matured, I guess, as a genre. Do you know what I'm saying? Because while old, like, original OG horror, right, like, Dracula and Frankenstein, right? Mm-hmm. Those are very clearly like that gothic horror, right? And that's just what it is, right? It's not anything else. It's gothic horror, right? And it has some elements of other things in it too, like all good stories do, but it really is just horror, you know? But as time has gone by, I feel like writers have learned to do better and to, like, broaden the story, I guess, if that makes sense. Do you know what I'm saying? I don't know.
It's hard to do better as a story than Frankenstein.
No, I don't disagree.
It's got everything.
But I mean, I think it's because they broadened the genre. Not necessarily they're writing better than Frankenstein. I'm not saying that. But I think it's just that they've broadened the... I suppose maybe it's because gothic horror doesn't sell the way it used to. do you know what I'm saying?
People are not that into introspection nowadays.
No. The ghost isn't actually your father,
medias.
it's you.
We don't need to.
Yeah, no, I agree. In that way it kind of makes sense, but, like, I don't know, I just feel like anything, sometimes genres mature and they grow and then better stories come out of it, if that makes sense. Or more complex, I don't know what the right word is, but either way.
Maybe.
So, right, alright, so for those at home that don't know, what is I Am Legend?
So, the only way prior to reading this that I was actually familiar with it was the movie that came out.
So, yeah, the Will Smith movie, early 2000s, maybe?
Probably.
Something like that?
You know, time just sort of runs together nowadays.
True story.
But I distinctly remember, so let me ask you, what do you remember about that movie?
I remember that Will Smith was in it. Mm-hmm. And there were zombies. He had a dog. And he was capturing them or something, or he had one in his, like, secret lab lair kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I think he may have met another person at one point in it. Mm-hmm. I can't remember. And
do you remember the ending?
Maybe. I think it was like one of those sorrowful endings where it wasn't optimistic and hopeful. Is that fair? Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know. It's been so long, and I mean, it was an okay movie.
Yeah.
It wasn't bad, but it's not something that made a huge impression on me, if that makes sense.
I kind of thought at the end of the movie he found a cure, but then he died.
That may be.
Okay.
I remember there being some kind of a depressing ending to it.
I'll start with the big sticking point for me, is that this book is about vampires.
Yeah, you told me that, and I was like, what?
Not zombies.
Right.
And that feels like an insult. I realize that it's only a subtle difference, especially in the context that the vampires are in this book, because they're not... So, it's sort of like, in Dracula, he's like the main vampire, and then there's these all kind of undead vampires too, but they're not exactly immortal in the same sort of fashion.
Yeah.
So this sort of has two classes of vampire too.
Okay.
Right? So there's like the dead vampires.
Now, I do remember in the movie that they couldn't go in the sun, or they were sensitive to the light or something along those lines.
Like they didn't like to come out in the light. And then I thought maybe we were supposed to make the leap that they were vampires, and I just didn't.
I did not.
definitely thought that was a zombie movie.
But I also think that zombies are so deep in the culture right now that maybe they weren't in 1954 when that was first written or whatever. You know what I mean? That you wouldn't make the leap to zombie right away, maybe? I don't know.
Well, what's interesting, I thought, but now that I think about it, it makes a lot of sense because what's going on in the 1950s? Science fiction is huge.
Yeah.
So in this book, vampirism is caused by a bacterial infection.
Oh, like 28 days later style. Okay.
So and he actually like names this, he finds this bacteria looking through microscopes and stuff because he's a guy all by himself with nothing to do with all his time. And he spends a large amount of it drunk and angry, but then decides he's going to do something about it and starts studying things. So a guy with very little knowledge about science, and he's like just trying to find books and learn about basic bacteria.
Right.
And he like pilfers a microscope. So anyways, finds this bacteria, and then they sort of make this leap that the rest of the vampire stuff, like garlic is like an allergic type reaction for them, and then everything to do with like mirrors and crosses and religious symbols is a psychological sort of phenomenon from when they were living.
Okay.
That bleeds over
Fair enough.
in their like crazy convoluted brain.
Like, it's cool that they actually go to the effort, or that he goes to the effort of like laying that out. And I guess we should probably mention, so I Am Legend was written in 1954, and it was by Richard Matheson.
Yes.
So if you want to check it out, I guess maybe don't listen, and sorry if we spoiler alert something that's 70 years old.
I'm not apologizing.
Yeah,
For a
70,
spoiler
70 years old.
1950.
Right.
Sorry, not sorry.
Right.
Yeah. So he finds this out, but then he gets like upset and distracted again because he's human. He's a very flawed character.
Okay.
He does find a dog. It's the first living creature he finds other than himself, and this is over the course of like 2 years, I think. So he finds the dog, befriends the dog dies. And then he decides to sort of like sober up and just embrace this new reality. And so he's no longer studying really much of anything. He's just sort of like, this is what it is now. I live here. This is my life. And I'm just going to live day to day.
On. Right.
And then one day he sees this random girl walking across a field. He's like, oh my God, I've never seen another human. Okay. Since this has happened.
Okay.
So
right.
this is like 3 years in now. So 3 years of solitude with a pet dog for like a week.
Right.
So he's a little crazy. Their first meeting is complicated. Well, come to find out, in science fiction fashion, this bacteria has entered the human body and has turned into it's evolved. Right? It's mutated, and so now it doesn't kill the host. So these are like regular people, but they're still infected with this vampirism, and they've made basically, think like Blade. They've made not a cure, but something that will, so it's like a capsule they take that has blood components in it, and also something that keeps this virus or this bacteria from reproducing and killing them.
Okay.
And so now they're recreating this whole society of vampire humans, and they basically sent this girl to spy on him, which she does, and then assaults him and then leaves. So then they come back and break into his house, and he shoots at them, they shoot at him, and they decide that they're going to execute him, and he is the last human. And as he's standing here in this like cell looking out the window, he realizes, oh, life has moved on, and they hate me because I have killed a bunch of their kind, and I am to them what they are to me. And he takes a bunch of pain medicine and then embraces his fate.
That's right. Yeah. Okay. I remember, I've never read it, but I remember talking about that ending of the book or whatever, about how he overdoses basically or whatever, so.
So they execute him, but basically this girl that he met for like 2 days had a soft spot for him, so she gave him pain medicine so that he could basically be oblivious for the whole thing.
Right.
So yeah, he's definitely a very flawed character. At the very beginning, before all this happens, they don't really, like, the story isn't set at all in the before time, but occasionally he has like flashbacks to what happened before. So he had a wife, he had a daughter. The daughter dies. When the plague first breaks out, they still think it's some kind of science thing before everybody loses their mind entirely and is like, oh, vampires, religion, we're all dying, the end of the world, which they kind of are. So they decide at the beginning, we're not really sure how it's spread, but we think it's some kind of disease. So they create a giant pit of fire, and everybody just throws their dead loved ones into the giant pit of fire.
Oh, right on.
Yeah. So when his daughter dies,
forget burning books. We're burning loved ones now.
Yeah, and they like come and seize them, and it becomes like a crime to not report your dead family and have them disposed of properly. And then his wife ends up dying as well, and he doesn't take her in, so he like sneaks off somewhere and buries her. And then she comes back to the house and tries to eat him. So then he has to kill her and bury her again. So yeah, very, very flawed character. He has all this death and loss, and he's alcoholic, and he's prone to bursts of outrage. But he is, I don't even know that you would, I guess it's force of will, but it just mentions in there several times, he's just like, I'm not really sure why I keep doing this. Like, he does not have a purpose for a large portion of it.
Right.
So it's less like will to live and more like stubbornness about dying.
Right. Well, in a way, it's kind of realistic, because if you don't have if your will isn't broken in such a way to just give up, right?
Yeah. Or
maybe that's not part of your worldview about suicide or whatever, then you just sort of keep on keeping on because, well, that's just what we do, right? So, right on. So anything else about that specific story? Like, I guess, do the vampires not want to have, like, superpowers? Are they, like, Vampire the Masquerade vampires? Or
they can get shot. And the scientific explanation for this is that the bacteria causes some kind of gluiness.
Okay.
So that when they get shot, like, this immediately encases the bullet, and so it doesn't go on causing damage and causing hemorrhage.
Okay.
So it's been, like, contained. So they can get shot, like, multiple times, and that doesn't seem to bother them.
Okay.
But stakes and, like, penetrating them with something that stays in place, or, you know, like a really deep cut, kills them because the air is bad for the bacteria that's keeping them alive.
Okay, cool. Right on.
So it mentions aerobic versus anaerobic.
Right, yeah.
So, the pseudoscience in it is pretty good. It's interesting.
Well, especially for 1954, you know.
You can tell somebody put some thought into it, and it's appreciated.
Alrighty, so I got a couple notes here as you were going on, kind of talking about this, right? So just some, and they're kind of true for almost any of these stories, it seems like. So it seems to me that most of the main characters in this are always alone, right? And which is kind of something we're going to kind of get into in a little bit, but they're always flawed characters, but sort of like an everyman character. So they don't, like, it seems like to me that a lot of them don't have some huge, like, scientific knowledge or medical knowledge or whatever. They're just regular people. Do you know what I mean? Like an everyman, but like a flawed everyman.
Well, and that usually tends to be the assumption for a couple of reasons. One, because we nerds aren't typically thought of as being the most strong and physically fit specimens.
Well,
but also, a lot of your nerdy people are on the front lines of things like this.
Yeah, that's true. But I also think
scientists and, you know,
I think from a storytelling perspective, though, I think it makes sense, because when the character doesn't know anything, as you tell the story, the reader or the person playing the game can discover it at the same time, right? So there's not you don't have to do all this exposition and say, well, he's a physician, so he just knows blah 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 blah.
Right.
You just sort of discover it as the story goes along with the character or whatever. So I guess it kind of makes sense in that way. Obviously, lots of solitude. You know, which is sort of being alone. We kind of talked about that. The focus of the stories are always what's happening now, but there's always these flashbacks or dreamscapes to kind of give context to what life was and what they lost. You know, so it's always like, my life was always better back before whatever this thing is as it happened.
Well,
and
it provides like an emotional depth to the character as well. Because really, when you're talking about like survival fiction, you're really talking about, you know, like humanity versus nature, and what makes a person different than the rest of the world around them than any other animal.
No, I agree. Also, their inability to deal with whatever the problem is causes them grief later on, like in a huge and significant way. So Morgan in The Walking Dead, you know, he couldn't shoot his wife, you know, it's just a consistent trope over and over and over again, right? Where whatever the problem was, you just couldn't deal with it, and now it's come back to haunt you, right?
That's actually kind of brought up in here too. I mean, it mentions his wife, but also consistently throughout the story, the guy who he was like one of his coworkers that he carpooled to work with every day, is living in his neighborhood as a vampire, and they can talk, but they're not necessarily like, they're good at like they're trying to entice him and get him to come out of the house, but it's all like for this goal of basically eating him.
Yeah.
So it's not like
right.
Again, it's not like Dracula where it's that higher level logical thought, but they can communicate.
Right.
But so his friend will come out and call him by name every night and tell him to come out of the house.
Right.
And so he kills a lot of the vampires in the area around his house, but he has difficulty finding him, and he actually makes a game of one point of basically finding Ben. Like, that's his game every day. I'm going to go out and I'm going to try and find Ben, and if I find him, I don't know what will happen, if I will kill him or not.
Right.
And then when they come for him at his house, they like just obliterate all of the regular undead vampires on the way to get him because they're like this new evolved strain or whatever.
Right.
And he's looking out and he can see Ben on the roof of this house across the street, and he's sad because he's like, I didn't want him to die like that. Like, I should have been the one.
Oh,
it
right.
should have been, he should have been asleep when it happened. And so there's like some regret and sadness about this person that he used to know, even though he's not really there anymore.
Right. Right on. So then I got endurance and like the triumph of the human spirit. These constant just being worn down and broken, and that's on a lot of survival fiction or whatever, regardless of whether it's horror or not, like Jack London and all that kind of stuff. There's just loads and loads and loads of that. Some of them, it seems like more in the horror genre of it, there is just a lack of purpose for the person. Do you know what I'm saying? Like in Jack London, like the purpose is I'm in the tundra or whatever it is. I have to survive. Like everything else melts away. I just got to live. But in some of these horror ones, it's not the environment crushing you in the Jack London kind of a way. Do you know what I mean? Like, I realize you could make the argument that zombies and the vampires in this situation could be considered environment, but it's not that same kind of...
What I thought was interesting about this one versus a lot of the other like zombie survival stuff that I've seen, like when you watch Walking Dead, right? There's still a fair amount of people around.
Yeah.
Even though it's post-apocalypse, it's zombie, it has a lot in common with this story. But the fact that it's one guy versus, several small groups of people. So when they go out and they're looking for supplies, it's difficult and things seem to have been depleted. When the guy in this book goes out,
stuff's everywhere.
Like he goes through 2 or 3 microscopes before he finds one that he likes. Like, he'll just go out for the day and be like, this is what I'm getting today. And like, he lives on the, in it. I don't know if it's in a city or on the edge, like a suburb kind of, sort of what I got the impression. But yeah, so there's not a scarcity of resources in the same way. Everything has to be within a distance of his house.
Right.
And that's pretty much it. So, like, he has a car, he has a house, he has a generator, he has gas for his generator, he has a freezer, like, all these things.
That's another thing that I was going right into from there is this is the gathering of resources, right? So obviously something has happened, they don't have anything, and then a lot of the book the stories are spent gathering up stuff, right? You gotta get, which is sort of like a trope for basically every role-playing game there is. Like, we've got to gather the magic sword to finish the quest, so we gotta find a sultry tart in a lake, or we've got to go find the Necronomicon so that we can, dispel the Cthulhu summoning, or like, no matter what it is, no matter what version or genre you're gaming in, essentially it always comes down to get the cool toys,
resource management,
do the cool stuff. Do you know what I'm saying? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting because it's sort of like the difference between, I would compare it to the difference between a shopping spree and like a scavenger hunt. Do you know what I'm saying? And while a shopping spree is fun, scavenger hunt is way more fun. Do you know what I mean? Like, well, what do we need? Oh, we need something that digs. Okay, well, that could be a shovel or a hoe or maybe a metal rake and a pinch or a snow shovel, but it really doesn't do what we need, or a spade, or, do you know what I'm saying? Like, and I guess
it's more like, I have a problem, I need to find something that will fix the problem.
Right, yeah.
And then, what you use to do that is kind of up in the air.
Yeah. Yep. So then I got the weakness of the apocalypse. Like, there's this big thing of like trying to discover the weakness of whatever the current problem at hand is. So in the case of these vampires, it's obviously the weakness of the bacteria, the air, causing problems or whatever, or whether they, daylight versus nighttime, all that kind of stuff.
But they don't know that initially.
Right.
He actually finds that out. There's suspicion that it's disease before, but they were never able to prove it or anything like that.
Right.
So the whole, like, probably about halfway through the book you find that out. Beforehand you don't really know, like, is this supernatural or is it something that's actually caused by infection.
Right. And then the last thing I have is it's just a changing of the time. It seems like a lot of these ones, especially in the horror genre, that when it involves this kind of survival stuff, it's just you realize the world is moving on and it's sort of shifting gears, right? So we go from in this case, just like you specifically said, that they're the next evolution of people or, intelligent creatures on the world, right? And that's how he looks at them and has that realization, right? And it's kind of throughout a lot of stuff it's that way. So do you have any, that's just as we were talking, I was just kind of making some notes about high points of story, and then other ones that I can think of, those things that happen. Oh, I guess I got to cut one more, is that there's always some kind of companion that arrives, and it never goes well for them. Right? It's like, oh, here's a companion. Oh, my life is so good. I can talk to them and whatever. And then there's some friction and we have a human element for a minute. And then, oh, they're dead. Or whatever it is that happens, right? They get driven away or whatever it is,
Well, you have to reinforce that isolation and loneliness.
Yeah, right.
Otherwise, the book feels very monotonous.
Yeah. Without shadow.
Every day was the same for 160 pages.
Right. Right on. So, should we go into some of the gameable aspects of this, or should we talk about some other inspiration real quick?
I think we should touch on just some other inspiration.
Okay. So I've got a couple here. The one that actually just popped into my head is Day by Day Armageddon.
Oh, that was going to be my first one.
Okay, right on. So it's by Max Brooks, I think.
No, it's not.
Oh, it's not?
Not even close. J something.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
That should be...
Not J.J. Abrams. We've got them, don't we?
We did. I thought we did. I don't see it on the horror shelf, though.
Maybe we'll let somebody borrow it. I don't know.
Oh, it's J. Something with a J. I was thinking like JB. I don't know, my phone is downstairs. So
Jason Bourne.
No.
Hang on a minute, I'll find out. J.L. Bourne. It is J.L. I thought it was. I was like, how think? So there's a couple of those. I think there's two, and then there's a third one that I don't know that's related to the first one. But it's very interesting because it's written like a diary.
Yeah, the second one, though, I think at the end of the first one, he finds other people. And the second one is pretty much all him and other people. But
because they're like on a boat and stuff.
He's mainly solo.
Yeah, because there's a guy, like a neighbor across the street that he can see, but they kind of communicate a little bit, but he doesn't ever leave the house to go, and then eventually things go bad for him or whatever. So that one popped into my head when we were just talking about things. I completely forgot about that one. So it's an interesting take on it, and it's done like a diary, so I don't even know it'd be hard to run an RPG in that kind of diary sense unless it's just like a solo thing. Do you know what I mean? Like where it's literally you by yourself.
Yeah, well, that's the idea. Is I wanted to talk about solo post-apocalyptic RPGs.
Oh, with like no GM.
Because anytime, well, no.
Okay, so that's what I'm talking about. Like maybe if you wanted to portray that, there's a way that you could. Do what they call an oracle, where it's a chart of events that happen, and you could just journal like that actual person. Do you know what I'm saying? You know what I mean? But yeah. As far as running a game and that kind of a thing, if you want to do it where it's like that diary style, I don't know how that would. You have to think about that and see how that would work. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. Could be cool though. But so my next one that I have is The Road. Okay.
I figured you would mention that. I couldn't remember what it was called. Yeah. But
so, The Road is a book and a movie. And the movie is about as bleak and terrible as it can get. And if you think it can't get any bleaker and more terrible than that, then read the book and have your soul crushed. And they're very good, but very hard. Like, the characters don't even have names, in it. Like, and I think they do that intentionally. So it's like sort of like dehumanizes people, It's like some kind of after the world is broken kind of a thing. And while there's a kid in it, the focus is really on the adult male, and I think it's never really spelled out like it might be his son, but you're not really. It doesn't. I don't believe it actually spells it out exactly. Cause it's been a while since I've read or watched that, but I think that's a good example of where you could have a solo game, but have someone else there who's sort of like. Not like the MacGuffin, like you got to protect them, but they're not helpless either. Do you know what I mean? Because like his whole thing is he's teaching this boy how to survive and things to do because he knows eventually he's going to die, right? And so, but that does a really good job of the bleakness of things and how terrible people can be to each other. But that'd be a really rough game to play. You know, so, but I think you could, if you were to draw on that for inspiration for moments, I think it would be really good and add a lot of context and some really good dark, hard moments. But I don't know that it's hard. One, it's hard to maintain that level the entire time, which is actually kind of impressive for that book to be able to do it. But at the same time, if you don't have those up and downs, it's kind of hard to maintain a compelling story.
So there were some other books that came to mind that aren't exactly like this and that have other secondary characters but maybe only like in portions of the story. So one of the first ones that came to my mind after that was the Gunslinger.
That's actually, I have it written down as well.
Yeah, and while he, gets some companions and there's still small towns and stuff, the first book especially is largely him by himself left with his own thoughts.
Right.
And then there's another portion, I can't remember of which one, but it's basically mostly him recollecting times when he had other people.
Yeah.
And it's that post-apocalyptic feel is definitely there. Yeah, he keeps saying the world has moved on, and he's sort of literally. Like similar to Robert Neville, our character in I Am Legend. He's sort of a relic of something that
a bygone era
is not a thing anymore.
Yeah. Except I guess one difference would be is that in that Roland is hyper confident at what he's good at, but he doesn't fit in the world at all anymore in a way, both in sort of his mindset and in what his role and function is, I guess, because the world's kind of become lawless and whatever. So, but yeah, the first book popped in my head. That was the first one that came to mind right after The Road. So I was like, oh, this is kind of there, because like when he goes into the village of Toll, there's a lot of people there, right? But they're like, he interacts with them, and
he's perpetually an outsider. Yeah,
that's the thing, is like they're like sort of like scenery for him in a way. They're there to give context for how detached from regular people that he is, because while he's the gunslinger and he's Roland and they know that, they also know what he represents, so they kind of are standoffish with him because they know of how much danger he is, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Do you have any more?
Then by the second book, he's kind of like the second Day by Day Armageddon book, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, by the second book, you get the drawing of the three, and he gets some companions. Which I guess we get a couple companions in the I Am Legend book, too.
Yeah, the dog.
They're a little more constant in the... in the Dark Tower series.
Well, also it's like 33 books or whatever it is before, so you kind of can't have one guy by himself for 15 books or whatever it is.
So I was talking to my friend about the idea that we were going to be discussing this evening, and she mentioned one that I hadn't thought of, and then I was like, oh, it kind of fits in the same way that Roland kind of fits, right? So the video game The Legend of Zelda. So in the Breath of the Wild, you're basically in a post-apocalyptic time, and there are towns and people you meet that help you along the way, but a large portion of your journey is you by yourself surviving and fighting.
Right.
So just an idea for consideration.
I can see that, but the only thing that takes me away from that, and it's just the genre of the game, is it's not as sort of sinister and dark as a lot of the other ones. You know what I mean? Like, I agree that there are aspects of it that are very definitely there, but I don't feel like it has the same darkness that like the Gunslinger, or definitely not The Road, obviously.
It's got a hopefulness to it.
Yeah. I agree. But it definitely has. I think it's a great example of something that you could use for inspiration to contrast your moments of The Road with moments of Breath of the Wild. It's kind of a weird smashing of two things that should probably not be together, but I think they're in those mashups. There's some room for some really good games and stories in there. So that's really cool. Zelda and The Road mashup. I'm writing that down.
I mean, you do spend a lot of your time trying to make food.
No, you definitely do.
Avoid the elements.
I think the difference is like you said, because you're doing the same things. It's like avoid the big bad monsters, find food, cook things, survive, stay on track, on track for what you're trying to do.
Well, I think the big difference is in one,
the bleakness is not the same.
You know what the cause is.
Oh yeah, it's true too.
And you're working towards overcoming.
No, you're 100% right there, because in The Road they don't even know, and it's not. Yeah, it doesn't even factor into the story.
Right. It's hopeful versus hopeless. Mm-hmm. And that's really the fantasy versus horror.
True.
I mean,
true. Bam! You got it right there. That's exactly what it is. But yeah, that's kind of interesting to think of it that way. So right on. All right. So The only we already kind of mentioned him before is Jack London. A lot of the Jack London stuff is very much in that vein. Maybe not so much horror, but very much that survival adventure fiction is there.
And there's a whole list of those. So Call of the Wild, Hatchet. I'm sure there are more that I'm not just thinking of right now.
White Fang technically is in there, I guess you could say. My favorite one is not by Jack London. It's The Iceberg Hermit, and I don't even know who wrote it. We have it around here somewhere. But I read it forever ago, and it's about a guy that was on a whaling ship, and he's like a greenhorn. He's a first-year sailor, and they hit an iceberg, and the ship goes down, and he ends up on an iceberg, and he has to survive because, well, no one wants to just give up and die. So, and that it sort of follows him through the remainder of his life or whatever, but super good. I haven't read it in a long time, so it may not hold up the same way. It was kind of like a young adult book, but I just remember really, really enjoying it when I first read it. So
I know I've read some books like where people are marooned, but I don't know that I've ever. I guess Castaway would be a good example of that movie.
Well done.
But it does a really good job.
I agree.
Showing the struggle and the psychological struggle of someone.
That, and then the small things too.
He's
the small
very much an ordinary guy to start out with. He has basically zero survival skills to begin with.
Yeah, I agree.
But there are other ones with like multiple people. I read The K when I was younger. That's another example with two people. There's the whole Swiss Family Robinson. Really just kind of marooned fiction is another entire genre, sort of like the regular survival fiction that's there. But so all of those are good for pulling bits of inspiration from, even if they don't fit quite exactly.
Right. Yeah, fair enough. All right, so then what about some gameable concepts and system ideas and that kind of stuff for how we're going to run this game? What do you think?
So,
all right, let me ask you this first. Let me back up. So, do you envision this game as like a one shot or as like a mid level game, like I don't know, 3 to 5, 7 sessions, or is this like a long running thing? Like, how do you see it?
I don't think it's a one shot because what you're looking for is an arc of character development. Or, an arc of failure in that aspect. But, an attempt at character development and growth. And so I think, mid-level would work, or longer, but definitely not a one-shot.
I agree.
More than 2 or 3 sessions, I would say.
Right. So I guess the number one question is going to be then, how do you maintain that grind of survival without it becoming the hopeless grind of survival? Do you know what I'm saying? Because like there's this weird thing that happens with some of those books where it's like Jack London, while he's sort of like created the genre in some ways, he's very dry. So maybe he's not the best example of it, right? Because when you're reading that, because of his writing style being kind of dry, it becomes a slog to get through it, right? And I think I would compare that to some of the other ones where it's like it's not as bad. Do you know what I'm saying? They're more. I don't know if I want to say that they move faster, but like there's still that struggle to survive and that grind, but it doesn't feel as tiresome. Do you know what I'm saying? So, like, where is that at? Do you know what I mean?
Well, I think part of it is basic needs stuff. So, food, water, granted, we kind of established that those things aren't a scarcity, but they're still things that you have to venture out in the world to find.
Right.
And in this particular setting, there is a time crunch. There's always a time crunch. Like, you can find something, but you only have these, 8 to 12 hours, depending on the time of year.
I agree.
And you have to be back at your house.
So,
and there's always, mechanically things that can go wrong. Your car breaks down, you get a flat tire, there's a malfunction with your generator. There's umpteen things that can go wrong from just a basic needs survival standpoint.
So I guess one thing I might say is that whatever obstacles and failures that come up, I think to avoid it becoming a slog, you have to make each of them be a different kind of challenge. Maybe not necessarily dice roll kind of challenge, but a different style in terms of the way it's solved and the tools that you need to use to solve it, right?
I think when it comes to capturing the sort of monotony of the way things break down and making it ever present without kind of reiterating the same thing verbally again and again, is to use something similar to the Apocalypse World shot clock or a stack of poker chips or whatever, but something that tracks the durability of the goods that you possess and the quantity of resources.
Right. And that's what I was just going to mention is that I think there's, depending on your player that you have in this game, maybe there's two ways to do this, right? One is more of an abstracted way, like you're talking, where it's just, this is our pile of resources, right? So whether that's food, water, tools, repair kits, and that kind of stuff. Or if you have someone who's more wants to be down in the weeds and the specifics of it, then you just adapt it and you just say, cool, now we're tracking water, rations, salted meat, oil, whatever, fuel, whatever,
Well, I like the idea of, like, those things, yeah, but we track those mostly on a character sheet already anyway.
Right.
I mean, like, bigger things, like, you have to perform maintenance on your generator.
Right, yeah.
And you have to perform maintenance on your house and put up new boards.
Right.
And so it becomes almost a resource management. So this is the amount of time you have allotted this week.
Okay.
And you need to dedicate some time to each of these things before the chips drop to 0, or you're going to have a critical breach incident.
I see what you're saying.
You know what I mean?
Right on.
So almost like, there's like board games like that, kind of.
Yeah. No, it's like it's sort of like
becomes a second gameable aspect.
Yeah. No, I agree. So I wrote down something that's probably terrible and is going to make me a little crazy to even say it out loud, but I feel like in this kind of a game where you have all these problems popping up, I think you need, I'm going to steal from like some terrible like motivational seminar or whatever, and you need to have like SMART goals. Do you know what I'm saying? Like for the character, like specific, measurable, attainable,
time.
Right. And time.
Realistic,
yeah, whatever it is. So, but I think you should use those as not as a way to like tell them that and keep them on track.
I think you should use that as a way for them to tell you what they want out of the game.
Right. And then to build challenges around that, right?
So if your player decides, I want to find a cure. Right. Okay, then we can figure out how we do that. But if they don't have a goal, then you only have the monotony part and you don't, that's okay, and it's okay if those goals change. It's okay if you succeed at some or fail at some. But that sort of moves the story along in a way that's more interesting than just resource management. So I agree that was going to be one of my points too. Like your player has to have goals.
Well, and then I think it comes down to, and this is going to be kind of a weird, a difference between the way you run things with a group of people versus when it's just you and one person, right? So when you're running a game in a group, when there's discussion happening and people are like problem solving or brainstorming, you get to hear that as a game master, right? But a lot of times when you're running, not even a lot of times, when you're running a game with one person, they may not immediately verbalize out loud what they're thinking, right? So then you're just sort of sitting there and then they come up with this idea and you're like, oh wow, whereas if it was a group, they may have been like, that is a terrible idea. What if we modify it a little bit and then we don't all die? Do you know what I'm saying? You know what I mean?
Well, the other part I like about it too is, so the one-on-one gaming scenario is pretty intense, right? And if you tell me what your goals are ahead of time, that gives me a chance to think about ways to challenge you.
True.
In pursuit of those goals. So a lot of times, for me anyway, planning some of those challenges ahead of time makes them more well-rounded and more interesting than if I'm just making them up on the fly.
Yeah. Well, and there's a difference too between saying, I'm going to sit down, I've got, I mean, there's always pressure when you run a game, right? But let's say in terms of like, the pressure to run this game is going to go from 0 to 100, right? So if I sit down one-on-one and have nothing, and I'm just 100% seat of my pants, I've got a 100% of the pressure on me to run this game and perform and come up with cool stuff, right? Which is just not the ideal situation to function under. Whereas if I sit down and I say, I've come up with 3 decent challenges that I can drop in wherever, right? And we hit a slow point, cool. I pick the one that makes most sense in the moment and I drop it in. So now I go from like 100 in terms of how hard this game is on me to run. Now maybe it's down to maybe a 60 or a 50, right? So I still have the ability to ad-lib those things in there, and maybe I can pop in a challenge and just hit the spark of inspiration the right way, and this makes sense in this moment, great. But if it doesn't happen, I still have like 3 challenges in my back pocket to just, boop, here it is. Here's something fresh and new, not necessarily rehashing some old things, right? But then, it takes some of the pressure off of you. So I guess obviously when there's kind of ties back to what I was saying before about listening to people brainstorm, it gives you a moment to think and be like, what do I want to do? What's the next move? Oh, they are thinking this. Okay, so I'll start thinking in that way too. You know what I mean? And I guess it kind of, I didn't get to finish the thought before, but I think it's important to mention, to tell whoever you're playing with to think out loud, right? Because that will help you as the game master, but also along with thinking out loud, we've gone to a lot of games now where they don't even necessarily involve a relationship mechanically, but we started to incorporate that into the way we run our tables now. And I think it would be even better in this situation where you could have sort of like maybe a rough map of something, maybe just like concepts of what, things that are there, problems that exist, and resources that are there. Because sometimes when, as a player or as a game master, when you're running something, you get so focused on a couple things, you almost forget, oh, I do have that box of 45 shells back at the base or whatever it is, right? So when you can see all these things laid out in front of you, it helps. And plus that, in a game about resource management, if you take note cards and have them in half, right? Because you have a bunch of little cards, right? And every item that they get that's worth tracking, it's written down. When they expend it, they have to physically tear the card up, right? And there's this visceral reaction to tearing things and to destroying them or whatever. 10 Candles is a great example. When you actually light those cards on fire, like, holy crap, I just set this card on fire.
Well, there are a couple of games too that come with cards with some resource options, like the Zombie World boxed RPG has different locations and different resources that you can have available to you, just as a good reference for possibilities.
Right.
And then there was another card-based LARP. I cannot recall what it is right now.
Oh, black cards with white letters.
And it had resource cards. Similar idea.
Yeah. No, I agree.
If you happen to have any of those kinds of games that already come with those things,
you can totally repurpose them. And if you didn't like the game the first time, just tear the cards. So, right on. So I think that's a good way to sort of work around to make it a slog, but not to have it still be fun and interesting and compelling.
I think there's a couple of other really important points so that this doesn't become monotonous. Okay. So we talked about how the characters in these stories are not perfect people, and part of that is because they're not the most competent. They're not exactly the right person for a job. They're a victim of circumstance, right?
Right.
But another portion of that is all of these characters come with a vice that is, or two, or three, whatever.
Right.
In Robert Neville's case, it's, rage and alcohol.
Right.
But I think in sort of the White Wolf sense of character creation, I think it's going to be important for the character to have a virtue.
Right.
Or
virtue
like Trail of Cthulhu, some pillars of sanity. Like you need to have ways that this person is decompressing and dealing with just the constant barrage of psychological trauma. And
then drive, too, from Trail of Cthulhu, because then you can use it, like, why is it when all this is happening? Well, you're still here, so why is that?
But I think the vices are another particular thing that I would add to that system specifically, because I want to know if your character fails, what is going to be their reaction? How are they going to lash out? And I think that's something you should establish ahead of time with the person that's playing, so that they know, okay, when this gets to be too much, this is how my character is going to lose it, and I'm going to have to deal with the consequences of whatever that may be.
I agree.
If it's I broke something important, if it's, whatever.
Well, and then that adds an interesting element, too, to when the slog really becomes, when that grind really kind of wears you down, and then it's not, I'm tired and bored of this grind now. Now there's complications and consequences for me not succeeding and me not doing whatever it is, right? Right on, I agree.
Yeah, and I almost thought about, the Shadow in Wraith.
Oh, yeah.
As a GM, kind of offering your player a bargain. Like, okay, well, you could do this, but this is going to be the consequence. I don't know exactly, but I felt like there might be something there that you could...
The Shadow thing is really cool and interesting, but it's kind of hard to do well because the difference between like adversarial and obstructive is a really fine line. Do you know what I'm saying? So but I think there's some potential there.
In this case, not necessarily being the antithesis of the character, but sort of maybe operating as kind of their conscience,
like that lazy,
operating as their virtue or the vice in the back of their head. The angel and the demon on their shoulder.
No, I agree. I think it's kind of like that the lazy conscience, like, oh, don't get up today, don't go do it. Just stay here, 10 more minutes. Do you know what I mean? We've all been there. Do you know what I mean? So,
every
right on.
Single morning.
Right on. So, anything else about gameable stuff, or should we move right into system choices and that kind of stuff?
I mean, I guess it kind of falls into system, and we talked about the pillars and that, but just some representation of willpower and mental trauma. Like, I don't think a physical tracker is, a physical damage tracker is quite enough. I think you need to have kind of both represented in some fashion, whether that's, humanity or mental stress or sanity. I think that needs to be represented somehow.
I agree. So I kind of segueing from that into system stuff. When I was thinking about what I would use to do this, I don't often recommend it, but I almost thought Fate might actually work pretty good.
I wholeheartedly disagree.
Hear me out, though. So in the idea that I like so the stress thing is kind of there because, one, it's sort of like the spring that you keep compressing, right? And then at the end of the scene it goes away, right? And if you think about a lot of the way this fiction works, it's frustrating, okay, but nothing really bad comes from it. It's frustrating, nothing really bad comes from it. But then when we get to the point where we take a consequence, right, now those things linger and stick around. And the reason why I like the consequence is because now it doesn't matter mental or physical, it's just what level of consequence is it, right? So that could be whatever, hungover and drunk, or it could be, I'm actually injured, or it could be rage, or whatever it is, right? And I think that there are ways to manage it to where you're not hyper competent. Like in a lot of Fate games, it's like I just always succeed at everything, right?
That's because it's designed.
I don't disagree, but
characters.
I think that it's easily adjustable to say instead of having a +2 and 2 +1s and a 0, you go with 2 +1s, a 0, and a -1, or however you modify those numbers. Because it's not a stretch when the average die roll is going to be a 0, right? Now you're always going to have the Yahtzees where it's a +4 or a -4 or whatever, right? But on average, the bell curve leans towards 0. So if you just adjust what their modifiers are going to be to their rolls, whether you do skills or whether you do approaches for accelerated or just regular Fate core, but I think it works really easy and it will fit any genre. But I think that you can modify the amount of stress boxes they have. You can have it be mental and physical stress if you want, or you could just have it be stress, because I've seen a lot of the horror versions of Fate where it's just stress. Right? They don't care whether it's physical or because then when you have both of those, it's like I have 4 boxes of stress instead of just 2. Do you know what I'm saying? And so I like the I already mentioned it, but like the way it incorporates the conditions. I think any game where that is going to be a big part of it, where it incorporates mental, physical, and social trauma in the same mechanical way, I think is critical for this, because that's a big component for how the stories work. Do you know what I'm saying? So, and I just thinking about like games that are easy and clean, because my thought is that if I'm playing a game with one person, I don't want a ton of mechanics. Do you know what I'm saying? Like I want something pretty streamlined and clean. So I don't know that it's one that I would choose like right off the bat, but I thought, this might actually be an interesting choice and something to look at. And even if you don't use like it in its purest form, maybe that there are those moments or those parts that you take from it. Maybe we don't use stunts and all that stuff and the approaches, but we take the damage system from it. Where with conditions. You know what I'm saying? So I
don't know. I want a harsh system. It's a survival game. I want it to be harsh.
I agree, but I also think that you can modify that with either giving them less boxes or by just dealing out more stress.
Yeah.
So, but
okay, here's my wild and crazy idea. This is not my first go-to, but I think you could do something really cool with the Don't Rest Your Head system.
I agree.
Because of the madness and
I definitely agree, and so I chose Fate initially because it's one that's easily accessible and a lot of people know about, right? And I think you could modify it with a little bit of effort and it could work, right? But I do think that there are some smaller subsystems that we've seen that could work really well. Don't Rest Your Head is one.
So I just think, in that you're trying to stay awake, and you can fall into like this other sort of scary, dark dream world. But I think you could very easily use that system in this for the scary, dark dream world is really just your more animalistic giving in to hedonism self. Right. Whereas you're trying to walk this path of humanity and fighting for your survival,
right?
I think that would be an interesting way to incorporate the routine failure that is humankind.
Right. Well, the other thing that's fun about Don't Rest Your Head is, and it would keep the grind being interesting, is that when you roll the dice, there's pain, exhaustion, madness, and discipline that are rolled. And so each of those successes or failures are colored by whichever die. Your successes are like 1, 2s, and 3s, and then the success or failure is flavored by whichever group of dice rolls the most 6s or most 5s, right? So it would be an interesting way, because it will always be flavored differently depending on what dice roll high versus what dice roll low. Yeah. So
really, just like those labels perfectly capture the important,
I agree.
Important elements, I feel like.
So the other one that I thought about that was not as, sort of more in the don't rest your head vein, where it's a smaller game, is Dogs in the Vineyard, because Dogs is about relationships and stuff, right? So if you have something that's normal, it's a D6. If it's big, it's a D8, like that kind of stuff.
Holding on to history and sentimental objects.
Mm-hmm. So I think you could pull out all the Lord of Light stuff and just sort of leave that aside, and then just use a game about make a game about the stuff that you have. Because if you always think about a lot of the survival fiction, it's like, oh, this is not just the pistol that I have. This is my grandpa's World War II service pistol that he took and carried all through Okinawa and whatever it is, right? And so they can sort of bring you back, and it's sort of like when you watch in a movie when Roland has his guns. It's like, oh, these are like. He describes as the hands doing the work, right? And then in some of the books, when he goes into the model world and he's using a different firearm, he's like, it might shoot faster, but it just doesn't feel right. It's not the same, you know. And so I like how Dogs kind of does that mechanically with the dice, right? Plus, that in Dogs is really easy to say the environment is gets these dice. Right, it's very easy to make like abstract challenges with Dogs, I think. And then at the same time, you're talking about giving in to your baser human natures or whatever. That's already in there, all that kind of stuff. I think it could work pretty well. My only criticism of the system, though, is that it's really easy to die rolls are what they are, so you never know what you're going to roll. But if you total up the numbers of faces on the dice for your whole die pool, that kind of tells you who's probably going to win the challenge. So there's some,
Well, yes and no, because like the I Am Legend story specifically is kind of that zombie feel of being constantly overwhelmed. So it's not just like the nature you're fighting off. There's also some
other
supernatural element. So it's sort of that like mob action thing, right? Like you're always going to lose because if each one of them gets a die, even if you get 10, and if there's 50 of them, So we kind of mentioned them both already as we were going through stuff, but World of Darkness would be
easy one.
Would be an easy one. I like the broader list of skills for something like this. So I think could be helpful.
I'm going to push back a little bit on that, okay? And this is going to call back to Gumshoe 1-to-1, okay? So in a game where you're the only player, right? And especially in a world, okay, let me back up. I'll explain the way that they deal with it in Gumshoe 1-to-1 first, okay? So in Gumshoe 1-to-1, you make your character, and these are the skills you have, okay? In a Gumshoe sort of sense of things, right? The ones that you don't have, generally speaking, you make some kind of an ally or contact or resource that you have that can get you that information. It may cost you money, it may cost you time, it may, there's some kind of cost that comes along with it. But those things exist because there are people that you have and contacts that you have that you know. Now, in this sort of a world, that doesn't exist. So when you have a broader set of skills, that means there's actually less things that you have. Now, I realize we've talked about having the everyman and not having them be competent, but then when it kind of gets into the weeds mechanically, where you're talking about buying skills and what do I advance, and I want to buy 1 point of this, when you're looking at a White Wolf character sheet and you've got like 21 skills to choose from, now that's a little hard. Now, granted, a lot like etiquette, obviously you probably don't need to buy. So maybe there's some other that don't matter anymore.
But you get a character creation.
But nonetheless,
your background package.
Right. But nonetheless, it's still things that you have to choose, and dice that you may or may not have.
I see what you're saying. However, I like how it sort of it flavors the type of character you have. So it provides like a broader, not explanation, but like a broader understanding of what kind of character you are, what kind of person you are, the things that you've bothered to learn and skills that you've acquired throughout your life, right? And I don't view it so much as like this is mechanically complicated, or I'm not going to be able to do things if I don't have points in these. It's just a matter of the way I'm going to solve challenges is going to be skewed towards the things that I'm good at.
Right.
So, just for like a super simple example, right? If there's something a far distance away from me, if I'm not very good at jumping, I'm probably not going to jump down to get it. No. If I'm wicked good at climbing, I may climb up to get the thing. Like,
no, I agree. And I'm also a fan of saying, these are what you have. I don't know, man. Figure it out. Do you know,
and that's what the whole entire genre is about. Right?
Exactly.
It is the figure it out genre.
Yeah. Well, and I don't think that there's anything necessarily wrong with like saying that or having that kind of a game with your players, so long as you haven't built a challenge where they have no dots and jump and it's a jump challenge. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, you have to build challenges that don't necessarily have a clear way to solve them, but also don't have one way to solve them, right? Let your players be creative, reward their creativity, but also punish them with environment, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Right on. So I think the other one to mention after World of Darkness is obviously Gumshoe 1-to-1 is kind of designed not necessarily for survival horror, but I think there's some things that you could easily do to modify it to make it work with skill lists and that kind of choices and things.
The broader Trail of Cthulhu system in general. For sure, sanity. And we, that is a tracker, and then we kind of already talked about, pillars and...
Yeah. Well, and I think even in not necessarily the Trail of Cthulhu version of it, but in the Gumshoe 1-to-1 or Yellow King version where you're getting trauma cards, actually, because it gives you a discard condition. So you have this card, it has an effect. Once you do whatever it is on the card, then you can discard it. And they're not all good things either. Do you know what I mean? Sometimes it's like break something that you love, and then you can discard,
I like that too. And it always sort of reminds me of like Mansions of Madness too, right? Where you take sand damage or health damage, and then at any point you could end up with something bad that's on the other side of those cards.
Well, and then it's also fun because in the case of the Yellow King and that whatnot, I like to print those cards off because they're just printer paper or cardstock or whatever. So then when you discard it, you tear it up, right? So when you expend the ammunition or whatever, you tear it up, and there's just something really good and visceral about that. And I think that when you're playing a game,
good about it with bad things too.
Yeah.
Right. I've completely overcome this broken ankle. I get to rip that card up now. It's not impacting me.
Right. No, it just feels good. You know what I'm saying? It's like a sense of accomplishment as you get to tear it up and throw it away and be like, screw that broken ankle, whatever it is, right? But there's I don't know, there's just this I think that the game is kind of going to be more intense as it is, and you're kind of caught up ideally you're going to be caught up in the moment and in the emotion of the situation, right? And I think having those cards and things written down in front of you will help both the player and the game master stay on track with what things are out there, so nothing gets forgotten or whatever. Do you know what I'm saying? In terms of both the struggles that your character's going to have, but also the resources that they have to draw on as well. So
I had thought about, I meant to look at it, and I did not do it between when we talked about this and now, but that World of Darkness slasher RPG, because I thought that's probably designed to be mostly solo, right? It's with that in mind. It doesn't
say that, but I don't even know how you run that game, to be honest with you.
And plus I was reading the I Am Legend book, so there's a whole lot of vampire killing.
Yeah.
And in your zombie genre, there's a whole lot of zombie killing. So basically, you're kind of a mass murderer, kind of.
Right. Fair enough.
But I didn't take a broader look
I don't know. That's a hard one.
Into the system. I thought, I wonder.
I think if you're going to use that, you may as well just use World of Darkness and just call it, or Chronicles of Darkness in that case. But so what about some? Is there any other games to mention that you think would work well for this? To mention real quick.
I don't know. I'm like maybe All Flesh. You could do that, but again, it's sort of a simple system. But you can have basically any kind of skill in that system, and they have a pretty fleshed out resource list that I think would be cool to pull ideas from. But
all right, so let's segue into some games that you don't think that would do this well at all.
Well, my first one was going to be Fate.
So I see your points, but I think that with some Fate out of the box, I don't think it does it well. But I think with a few modifications, reducing the amount of stress that you can take and that kind of stuff, and just being more punishing with it, I think will overcome those problems that it has. But I think Apocalypse World, I think, clearly isn't going to work because...
Yeah, that relies on multiple players.
Yeah, you could do it, I guess, like, it might kind of work, but the Apocalypse World really works off the fact that there's more people at the table. That's really where it comes together and shines.
And I think you're going to fail and die very rapidly if you play that solo because the skill spread is so drastically different.
I agree.
While you can fudge some of the ways you're completing challenges, when you only have 4 core stats,
right?
Can't fudge it quite that much.
It's going to be hard.
Can't not quite that much.
So, D&D, like 5e, I don't think works necessarily because it's too hard to kill you.
Yeah, that's kind of the problem I see too. But if you made like a level 1 character,
but I was thinking more if you went more like the Morgborg LOTFP road, it might work. But it just wouldn't be my go-to though. I would much rather choose something else. But if that's all you know, or all like that's the compromise, and that's where I would steer it to away from 5e and into something a little more OSR.
I don't think Morgborg would be good for this at all.
What do you mean?
There's not enough there. I think when you're trying to do, it's an awesome one shot.
No, I agree.
Or a small number of sessions.
Well, I think that's another reason why the just regular D&D doesn't work either, because there's not that way to do sort of like mental social trauma. It just doesn't exist in the game. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I think they both fall short. I wouldn't choose any of it, to be honest with you, but if I had to, I would choose something with a little more OSR flavor because it's a little more grim and deadly, I guess.
Same thing with DCC.
Yeah.
Really.
Yep. No, I agree. It just doesn't fit. You know what I mean? The game isn't designed to do that. What else is there?
I can think of a whole ton of games that are just obvious choices.
Well, like things that are super crunchy, Burning Wheel, that kind of stuff. I think unless you have a group, a table that is super familiar with it, I think you can make it work really well with Mouse Guard. But it is a little crunchier and a little heavier than I probably want to be in a 1-to-1 game, I think. Do you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Burning Wheel is way too crunchy. Mouse Guard I might be able to pull it off with because I've played it a ton. You know what I mean? We've got a fair amount of familiarity with it. But
we have a lot of Power by the Apocalypse, so any game where you don't really die or don't die easily would not work well for this. So.
Right. Yeah, and like I said, that doesn't address mental or social trauma, which is one of the things that pointed me towards Fate initially. I was like, well, this just says this is your damage. It doesn't care what it is, right? So those are the big things that I'm looking for, I guess, is things that are flexible in terms of making sort of like abstract challenges and systems with mental, social, and physical trauma and ways to track damage. So, right on.
Played a lot of Aqualara recently. I wouldn't use that for this.
Yeah, the which is essentially Call of Cthulhu, right? The BRP. I agree. That wouldn't be my go-to. So yeah. Right.
Plus, oh man, a D100 system would be extra brutal though.
Yeah, it sure would.
But not like in a good way. Like you would just fail at any skills you were attempting that weren't these two things, and you'd be like, and so you died.
The solution to that though is to be a little more liberal with the modifiers for the rolls too. This is an easy challenge. This is a hard challenge, and that kind of stuff. So
yeah,
but
still, not every challenge is going to be an easy challenge.
No, I disagree.
And you're looking at less than 50% odds on nearly everything that you're attempting. So that's pretty brutal.
I agree. Right on. So should we wrap this one up here? Anything else?
I don't think so. No, I think we pretty much hit the... Is
this a game you want to play? Or you want to run? Or
I think it would be interesting. I would like to give something like it a try, and see if, it's one of those things, like, I think it would be easy to run, but difficult to run well.
Right.
Because this would be something, if not done well, it would be very flat and boring.
Yeah, but I think that... So here's the thing, and I'm going to push back a little bit on that, right? I think if you pitch this game to me, right, and you said, hey, I'm thinking about doing this, and I'd be like, right on, I'm all in. I love this genre. This is my jam, right? I have a weird love of suffering, apparently. I don't know, but like
boys in survival fiction, right? That's
well, yeah, but there's a lot of other things though that like that. I like stories about the perseverance of the human spirit. I just do. Do you know what I'm saying? And they don't even always have to win. Like, I actually don't mind the stories like The Road. It was like really cool, and this guy survived and pushed as long as he could, and then eventually it just didn't work out. And that didn't bother me. Like, it's bleak, but I like those stories. Do you know what I mean? Like that triumph against all odds until you just can't anymore. Do you know what I mean? So what I was going to say, though, is that I don't think this is as hard to run as you think, because if you said, I'm thinking about running this game, or I think I want to play this game, I'd be like, ooh, I really like this. I think we can do it. Let's do it. Well, right there, everybody at the table is already bought in, right? Mm-hmm. So provided that the person that you're, like, if you're running the game, obviously you want to run the game. And then if you've got the person to sit down, they're bought into playing it, that's the whole table, right? And provided that you have a, like, player and GM that both can, like, play off of each other, you know what I mean? And, like, that table chemistry or whatever, do you know what I'm saying? I think it comes together a lot easier than you probably think once you get over the initial hurdle.
I don't think it's impossible. I don't think it's hard to run. I think you need to make modifications to make it so it's not a monotonous, boring game like we talked about. Like,
okay, fair enough.
You have to account for things like vice and other forms of damage and stuff like that. So it's not just...
So if you had to pick a system to do it with right now, what would it be?
Probably World of Darkness. Probably White Wolf.
Right on. I think I would choose dogs, just out of the sheer curiosity to see if it would work that way. I think there's some interesting things that you could do with that.
Why did I say White Wolf? But the new vampire system incorporates the things that we mentioned from Trail of Cthulhu.
What do you mean? Oh, Virtue and Vice. And...
Well, that and your Pillars of Sanity is there, and...
no, I agree.
So it sort of borrows the things that I liked from that system, so maybe new World of Darkness.
V5 then, basically?
Yeah.
Well, and then you could easily change out hunger for, like, rage or
Sanity.
Sloth or whatever. But, like, if you had them pick up a vice, right? So in, like, vampire, it's hunger because that's the predator lurking inside you. But if you have a character who is just innately flawed, then it's just going to be whatever it would be. If you want to see with the 7 deadly sins from Chronicles of Darkness, you could just say, wrath, gluttony, envy, whatever it is, and change that out, and it could be interesting. That could work. Right on. All right, so I think we're going to wrap that one up here. So if any of you out there have ran solo games or have ran, I guess, even for multiple players at the same table, I'd be really curious to see how things came out for you and what worked and didn't work and the systems that you use and all that good stuff. So if you've done that well or not so well, I guess, drop us a line. You can hit us up at james@justmoorefix.com or on Twitter @justmoorefix, or you can, what's the other way you can reach us? Facebook. We have our Facebook group. You can hit us up over there. Be really curious to see what any of you successes and failures you guys have had out there. So this is a really kind of a different and interesting genre that gets touched on and is super popular in sort of the fantasy sci-fi genres, but doesn't really get touched on a whole lot in role-playing in like a big significant way. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So,
well, if we do post-apocalypse, right, so it's always like a group. It's not like solo survival fiction.
True. So, and as you know, we're a member of the Gonna Geek Network, so you can head over to GonnaGeekNetwork.com and check out all the geeky podcasts over there. And if you like what we do here at Just More Fix, you can head over to Patreon.com/JustMoreFix and support us over there and get access to all of our audio shows, and get access to all of our pre-shows and raw audio feeds, as well as our zine and PDF and print format. And join the awesome ranks of our Patreon supporters like Tiziano Furlano, Paul Hubbard, Hector Trelane, Timothy Barra, Alistair H., Alan White, and the OG Todd Olson. I think that'll do it for us this week, and we will see you all next week.
Thanks for listening. This has been an episode of Just One More Fix. Music has been provided by Kevin MacLeod. You can find him at incompetech.com. You can support us at patreon.com/JustOneMoreFix or follow us on Twitter @JustOneMoreFix.